you've watched the news or read the paper at all in the last few years, you've probably heard numerous times that America is in the midst of an obesity epidemic. And it certainly is. In response to this, many Americans have taken up dieting. In this video, we'll be discussing dieting and its effectiveness. To appreciate the fattening of America, you need to know what body mass index is. BMI is a way to report a person's weight while taking into account their height. If you just said somebody weighed 150 pounds, you can't tell if that's a short, fat person or a tall, thin person. So BMI is the solution to this. It's your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. So if you're interested in learning what your BMI is, there's lots of BMI calculators online that do all these conversions for you. Our government has defined underweight as a BMI of less than 18, normal weight as a BMI of 19 to 25, overweight as a BMI of 25 to 30, and obese as a BMI of over 30. So keeping these categories in mind, let's look at how obesity has changed in America over the last couple decades. The following graphs are from the CDC using those BMI definitions. So these graphs are showing the percent of people in each state with a BMI of over 30, the obese category. The colors represent how many people are obese in each state. White means that they didn't have any information for that state. Light blue is less than 10% of the state's population is obese, and darker blue is 10 to 14% of the state is obese. So here's where we're starting with 1985. 1986, 87, 88. Now we have a new category. That is 15 to 19% of the state has a BMI of over 30. In 1997, a new category was introduced. Specifically, states that have this tan color have 20% of their population with a BMI of over 30. In 2001, a new category was introduced. Specifically, 25% of a state's population has a BMI of over 30. In 2005, another category was introduced. Specifically, this maroon color represents states that have a population of more than 30% with BMIs of over 30. And as of 2011, yet another category was introduced. As of 2012, no state had a prevalence of obesity less than 20%. Colorado has the lowest rate at 20.5%. As you can see, there are only 9 states with obesity rates from 20 to 25%. 28 states in Washington, D.C. had a prevalence between 25 and 30%. And 13 states had a prevalence of obesity equal to or greater than 30% of their population, which is what that salmon color is. The darkest maroonish color is for 35% or higher, which thankfully none of the states have as of 2012. However, the fact that the CDC has created this new category means they must be assuming that soon many states will have populations with 35% or more being obese. Overall, 35.7% of U.S. adults are obese. In 2008, the estimated medical costs associated with obesity were $147 billion. And clearly, it's not just adults with expanding waistlines. Kids are growing as well. Childhood obesity has more than doubled in children from 6 to 11 years old and tripled in adolescents from 12 to 19 years old in the last 30 years. So childhood obesity has increased from 7% in 1980 to 18% in 2010. Adolescent obesity has increased from 5% in 1980 to 18% in 2010. As of 2010, more than 1/3 of children and adolescents could be categorized as overweight or obese. So why is obesity increasing? Clearly, obesity rates have risen, and quite fast too, but why? There's been a huge amount of talk about what may have caused this rapid increase in obesity, and there seem to be many factors that have played into it. The news media seems to come up with some wacky new explanation every year. For example, in 2010, everyone was convinced that plastics were making us fat, even though there's not enough scientific evidence to really back this claim up. The overall consensus, though, is that the environment is to blame. What we hear now is that we live in an obesogenic environment. The biggest contributors to the rising rates of obesity in the U.S. appear to be fast food, increases in portion size, availability of snacks, soft drink consumption, and the marketing of fast foods, snacks, and soft drinks. Americans eat food prepared away from the home slightly more than 200 times a year, and 75% of these meals are supplied by fast food restaurants. Fast food meals have more fat in them than home-cooked meals, 38% versus 31%, which can lead to weight gain. Why did fast food restaurants become so popular? Well, one reason is that a large percentage of women entered the workforce in the 1950s, which led to less time to prepare home-cooked meals. Another reason is that our technology advanced enough to allow food to be made in one place, but shipped to a fast food chain someplace else. Another reason is the cost of fast food. Fast food is often quite cheap, what makes it very appealing, not to mention the fact that it can oftentimes taste quite good. The final reason is that fast food companies simply have great advertising to pull their customers in. Portion sizes have also been on the rise since the 1970s. For example, from 1977 to 1998, the average salty snack portion size increased from 132 to 225 calories. The average soft drink size increased from 144 to 193 calories, and the average cheeseburger size increased from 397 to 533 calories. As we discussed last time, portion size affects our consumption. The larger the portion, the more we eat. And somewhat related to this is that our dinnerware has also increased in size. As Wansink has shown, we serve ourselves more, and in turn we eat more when we use larger plates. In addition, the availability of snack foods has skyrocketed since the 1970s, and as our options have increased, so has our consumption. On average, the number of calories per day from snacking has increased from 204 calories in 1977 to 409 calories in 1996. And this number might even be higher because of confusion as to what exactly a snack is. So it can be hard to define, which leads to a mix of research results. Our soft drink consumption has increased as well since the 1970s. In 1977, soft drinks accounted for 3.9% of our daily caloric intake, but by 2001, soft drinks accounted for 9.2% of our daily intake. So why did we start drinking more soda? Well, for starters, by the 1980s, companies came out with tons of new types of soft drinks. So now people have a larger variety to choose from. Additionally, the portion sizes have changed as well. In 1916, Coca-Cola was offered in a 6.5-ounce bottle. Later on, the bottle was increased to 12 ounces, and now the normal bottle you get out of a vending machine is 20 ounces. Sure, cans have stayed 12 ounces, but that's still 40 grams of sugar and 154 calories. And to make matters worse, people have a much harder time compensating for the liquid calories they consume compared to solid calories. People already struggle to compensate for eating a large lunch or perhaps snacking on a cookie. Unfortunately, people don't really compensate at all for the soda or two they drink with their lunch. As I've already mentioned, fast food marketing is very good. The biggest change in the last 50 years for marketing has been the reach of the television. Almost every household in the US has a TV, and by the mid-1990s, the average American spent 3 to 4 hours a day watching TV. So if you're viewing 3 or 4 hours of TV each day and can't fast forward through the ads, that's a lot of TV commercials that you're going to have to sit through. And you've probably noticed that food commercials tend to pop up the closer to dinner time you get. That's not a coincidence. To give you guys an idea of just how much money is spent on fast food advertising, for every $1 spent by the World Health Organization to improve the world's nutrition, $500 is spent by the food industry on advertising. And research shows that these ads really do influence what foods we buy. And they're especially influential on children and adolescents, who then beg their parents to get the foods they saw on TV. But it's not just TV ads. The food industry has also weaseled its way into school textbooks. For example, there are math textbooks that used breakfast cereals, soft drinks, and chocolate snacks in their exercises. The response to this epidemic has been to recommend dieting, and a lot of time and money has been spent researching the effectiveness of different diets. The message here is clear. Everybody can benefit from dieting, and everybody should diet. After 9/11, the Secretary of Health and Human Services said that everyone in America should lose 10 pounds as an act of patriotism. Everyone. Not just overweight or obese people, but everyone. Some schools have even added kids' body mass index to their report cards. This is ridiculous, particularly since at the same time, McDonald's started advertising on kids' report cards and offering free Happy Meals to kids who got good grades. Although it appears McDonald's has started to remove these advertisements due to some pretty bad PR. At the same time, policymakers were cutting physical education classes for many schools. Now, I should say that when I talk about dieting, I mean something specific. I mean severely restricting your calorie intake in order to lose weight. I don't mean casually watching what you eat or trying to reduce your consumption of certain foods. The question I want to focus on is whether doctors should recommend diets to treat obesity. Before doctors recommend any treatment for anything, they make sure it's safe and effective. That's what clinical trials are for. Phase 1 in clinical trials is to test the safety of a treatment. Phase 2 of clinical trials is to test for how well the treatment works, or its efficacy. And Phase 3 of a clinical trial is to compare the treatment's efficacy against the current gold standard treatment. So, it only seems appropriate that before we recommend dieting as a treatment for obesity, we need to make sure it's safe and effective. But for some reason, with diets, these questions are not asked. Doctors recommend them even in the absence of clear answers to these questions. I would also add that it goes without saying that we don't treat problems unless they're actually problems. So we also need to address the extent to which obesity is actually a problem. So, if we're going to treat diets like any other treatment when considering if we should recommend diets to treat obesity, we should consider 3 questions. Is dieting effective? Is dieting safe? And is obesity unhealthy? Now, any information that comes out suggesting that perhaps dieting is not the answer tends to be confronted with quite a bit of backlash. So I'm not necessarily expecting you to agree with me on how to answer these questions, but I do really hope that you at least agree that these are the right questions to ask. So first, do diets work? Well, to answer that question, we first have to decide what we mean by work. There have been different definitions of diet success over the years. Consider a woman who's 5'5", which is the average height for women, and imagine that she weighs 200 pounds. She has a BMI of 33, well into the obese category of 30 and above. How much weight would she have to lose for us to consider her diet a success? The original standard, used by doctors and our government, was the ideal weight as defined by the Metropolitan Life Insurance tables. This is just an example of one of the many tables that they've come out with. These tables had a different ideal weight for large-framed, medium-framed, and small-framed people at the same height. So basically, they instantly caused every woman in America to describe herself as large-framed. Anyways, according to the 1940s version of the Metropolitan Life Insurance tables, our 200-pound woman would need to lose 66 pounds on her diet for it to be considered a success. The thing is, they quickly realized that nobody was losing enough weight to succeed with that standard, so they came out with a new standard, which was to lose 40 pounds. They didn't seem to care how tall or large-framed you were. It was 40 pounds for every obese person. But a review paper from 1959 found that only 5% of obese dieters succeeded by this definition. In the 1960s, they lowered the standard again, down to 20 pounds, and soon after that, they started talking about weight loss in relation to one's starting weight. Specifically, a diet was a success if the dieter lost 10% of their starting weight. So in the 1970s, to succeed at our diet, our 200-pound woman would still need to lose just 20 pounds to be successful, which would still give her a BMI of 30, the cutoff between overweight and obese. But again, very few people achieved this standard. So in 1995, the NIH changed the definition yet again, this time to just losing 5% of one's starting weight. So our 200-pound woman would only need to lose 10 pounds to be considered a successful dieter, even though she would end up with a BMI of 32, still officially obese. But in addition to how much weight one needs to lose for a diet to be considered successful, there's also the crucial question of how long a person should have to keep that weight off, a question that's been almost entirely ignored for most of the history of diet research. The Institute of Medicine wants women to lose 5% of their starting weight and keep it off for a year. And by year, they mean a year since the diet started, not a year since they got the weight off. As I mentioned, diet research has pretty much ignored the question of just how long people can keep their weight off. Many diet studies have followed up with their participants, but only for about 6 months. And in these follow-ups, most people regained their weight to the point where they were back at their starting weight. All of these studies just assumed that none of their participants would gain any extra weight. However, this is a pretty big assumption to make. Now, you might be wondering why researchers haven't looked at any of the data collected by Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig or any of those other companies that track their customers for years and have weekly weigh-ins. Well, these companies refuse to release any of their data to anyone. Not only that, these companies don't even mention the long-term effectiveness of their diets in their business plans. The only commercial diet business plan that says anything about their diet success is Weight Watchers, bragging that their average customer enrolls in Weight Watchers 4 separate times, a pretty dubious claim to success. On top of that, in 1999, when the FTC tried to create policies about what information diet companies had to disclose to their customers, Diet industry executives argued that having to provide information on the effectiveness of their diets would discourage people from going on diets. So they do seem to know something about how effective their diets are. Ultimately, the FTC was only able to create voluntary guidelines in which disclosure of effectiveness information was simply encouraged. To determine the effectiveness of dieting, one group of researchers conducted a review to try to determine just how long people kept the weight off after going on a diet and how much weight was gained back over time. In their review, they were only able to find 8 studies that randomly assigned subjects to a diet group or a no-diet control group and that followed participants for longer than 6 months. Across those studies, the average amount of weight loss that the dieters maintained in the long run was 2.3 pounds, which just isn't much weight loss for anybody, particularly obese people. Unless you began your diet weighing around 46 pounds, this doesn't even approach the 5% of starting weight standard. Diet researchers know all about these small losses, and the way they defend them is by saying, yes, that isn't a lot of weight loss to maintain, but people who don't diet gain weight over time. So they claim that maintaining any loss is a huge success. Alright, that might be fair enough. And since these are the studies where people were assigned to diet or not to diet, we can see what happens to control subjects in these 8 studies. Well, these control subjects did indeed gain weight. They gained an average of 1.3 pounds. However, there is actually no difference between these two groups, statistically speaking. That is, statistically speaking, a 2.3 pound weight loss and a 1.3 pound gain is essentially equivalent. So based on everything you've learned in this class, and probably your other psych classes, you can probably guess that these studies are the best in terms of their methodology. They have a control group and an experimental group. However, most researchers who talk about the long-term effects of diets don't talk about these studies, but instead talk about a different type of study, the long-term diet studies that don't have control groups. In a review of 13 of these kinds of studies, researchers found that, on average, participants initially lost a lot of weight by dieting, an average of 39 pounds. But, on average, subjects gained back 32 of these 39 pounds. So, all these dieters had to show for their diets was a net loss of 7 pounds. This 7-pound loss isn't enough to satisfy the Institute of Medicine's 5% criteria for anyone over 140 pounds. Another way to think about this is to consider the percent of subjects who regained all of their weight plus more. According to the studies that report on that, just 7 of these 13, 1/3 to 2/3 of all subjects gained back more weight than they lost on the diet. I realize this is not welcome news for people who are trying to lose weight by dieting and to keep it off. And I hate to twist the knife any further, but in fact, these results are probably the positive spin. The actual situation is probably even worse, because these studies are loaded with systematic biases that make diets look better and more effective than they actually are. These systematic biases are follow-up rates, self-report of weight, confounding of diet and exercise, and participation in additional diets. Follow-up rates in dieting studies are very low. On average, only 33% of the subjects in the 13 diet-only studies returned for the follow-ups. Generally, low follow-up rates result from subjects being embarrassed to return. The participants who don't follow up are those who normally gain back the most weight. You can imagine that if these dropout subjects actually were included in the follow-up data, then the stats would probably look even worse than they are, basically showing that diets are even less effective. The outcome measure of interest in these studies is weight, And the best way to measure that by far is to bring people into the lab and put them on a scale. At the beginning of these studies, everybody does go into the lab and have their weight measured on a scale. But it's hard to get subjects to come back to the lab for follow-ups. So lots of studies just ask participants over the phone or by mail to report on their weight on follow-ups. Now imagine that you're an obese person who participated in a big diet study. Imagine that you gain a lot of weight back. When the researchers call you and ask you your weight, well, are you going to tell the truth? In fact, a meta-analysis asking this very question found that people tend to say that they weigh less than they actually weigh, and that this tendency is especially true for obese people in diet studies. In these 13 studies of the long-term effects of dieting, weight was frequently self-reported. In 3 of the studies, all follow-up weight was assessed by self-report. In the remaining 10, it varied from no self-report to 63% of subjects self-reporting their weight. Self-reporting one's weight biases these results, just like low follow-up rates. Both of these make diets look more effective than they actually are. Nobody ever lies and says they weigh more than they actually do, so self-reports are biased toward underreporting weight. Many participants in dieting studies also exercise. However, if the goal of the study is to find out how a diet affects weight loss, then the ideal situation would be one in which no one exercises in addition to dieting. Because of this, it can be difficult to determine if the weight loss and sustained weight loss found in these studies was due to diet or exercise. 9 of the studies examined in this review didn't even report on the exercise habits of their participants, so it's difficult to determine if exercise played some role. However, other studies have shown that participants who exercise tend to show greater weight loss maintenance than participants who simply diet. These studies also show that many times it's exercise and not dieting that results in long-lasting weight loss. Because these diet studies didn't assess the role of exercise, they introduce a lot of bias into their studies, again suggesting that their results are not as positive as they suggest. The final source of bias in these studies is that study participants might go on additional diets. Participating in additional diets can make the original diet, the one that's actually being studied, look more effective than it actually was, because diets do lead to weight loss in the short term. In the 13 studies with diet-only groups, anywhere from 20 to 65% of participants reported having been on at least one additional diet since the one being studied ended. There are some clear data showing that if participants go on additional diets after the one being studied was abandoned, it will bias the effects of the diet being studied to make it look more effective than it actually was. A survey of participants in a commercial diet program asked participants to report their highest weight since completing the diet program. 60% of the participants reported weighing more than their starting weight at some point in the 3 years since the diet had ended, and 40% currently weighed more than their starting weight, further bringing into question the effectiveness of dieting. In sum, both kinds of studies, those with and without control groups, have come to the same basic conclusion. Dieting does not result in long-term weight loss. Most people on diets won't reach their ideal weight. A clever study shed some light on the enormous gulf between dieters' weight loss goals and their weight loss reality. In this study, a group of 60 obese women were surveyed about their weight loss goals when they started a new diet. The women selected their goal weight for their diet and then also listed their dream or ideal weight, so a weight you would choose if you could weigh whatever you wanted. Then they were recontacted 48 weeks later to see how much weight they had lost. None achieved their ideal weight. Only 9% achieved their goal weight. 24% achieved their acceptable rate, so they weren't too thrilled, but they accepted their weight loss. And 20% were disappointed by the weight that they lost. That means that 47% of the women, nearly half, didn't even lose enough weight to reach their disappointment weight. So dieters aren't reaching their weight loss goals, but most of them would technically be considered successful dieters according to current criteria for diet success, which is losing 5% of their starting weight. And it's not for a lack of trying or for not wanting it enough. Not only do obese people want to lose more weight than they can reasonably expect to lose from diets, but they want it desperately. In a study by Nutrisystem, 50% of the women surveyed said they'd give up sex for a summer in order to not gain 10 pounds. About 25% of men agreed. This survey also found that in order to not gain 10 pounds over a summer, 54% of people would sacrifice watching TV, and 42% would give up using their cell phones. 38% would stop using their computers. So diets are ineffective. But why do diets fail? Well, that's the million-dollar question. Frankly, there are a whole lot of reasons why diets fail, both for biological and psychological reasons. First, let me just say a few words about biological pathways. Of course, your body has no way of knowing that the starvation it's experiencing from your diet is actually intentional. So a variety of powerful biological processes kick in to keep you from starving to death. And in fact, fat people who lose weight are similar to starving people in many ways. In particular, your body's chief tool in preventing starvation is decreasing your metabolic rate. So if you're not eating enough and you're losing weight, your body starts to cling to every calorie it can. It slows way down in burning calories and stores more calories. So you can get by with fewer calories than a person who's the same size, but who didn't get to that size by losing weight. So fat people who lose a lot of weight are very different than people who were never fat. Let's just pause a moment and think about how deeply unfair that is. A formerly fat person has to subsist on fewer calories than someone who was never fat. And if that formerly fat person can't do this and ends up gaining weight back, he or she is considered to have no self-control and to be a failure. That's a pretty cruel fate. Don't worry about knowing all those middle components like leptin or ghrelin. Just appreciate that there are many biological factors that lead to decreased metabolism, increased food take, and increased fat deposition that results from dieting. In addition to those cruel biological processes, dieting can also set into place certain psychological processes that make weight regain likely. These are all those things we talked about with dieters versus non-dieters. It's all those things that led dieters to overeat, but that had no effect on non-dieters. Things like actual preloads, just thinking you had a high-calorie preload. Self-esteem threat and negative mood can also influence this. The cognitive load component of the psychological pathway box simply refers to the fact that if dieters are worried about other things, so they're stressed out about their jobs or their relationships, for example, then they don't have the mental resources left over to watch what they eat, so they end up breaking their diet. In sum, dieters seem to be vulnerable to overeating in response to a number of factors routinely encountered in daily life, factors that have no effect on the eating patterns of non-dieters. So this is another way in which diets may ultimately fail, by leading to overeating in response to common daily events. Stress is one of these common daily events. Stress can lead to weight gain through both behavioral and biological pathways. We already know that stress can increase weight through a number of behavioral pathways. For example, stress messes up our sleep, which can cause weight gain. Also, stress often leads people to reduce their physical activity, which will definitely not help with a weight loss plan. And lots of research in and outside of the lab shows that if you put a dieter in a stressful situation, they'll overeat. In addition, as you know, stress itself leads to a number of physiological changes in your body. There are two main chain reactions that are initiated in response to stress. There's the sympathetic nervous system response, which releases a bunch of catecholamines such as epinephrine and causes symptoms that you tend to think of as happening when your body's under stress. Those events lead to increased caloric absorption and weight gain. There's also activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, the HPA axis, which releases a bunch of hormones like cortisol. One of the things cortisol does is make glucose available in your bloodstream, which is used by your muscles to help you fight or flee. But if your stressor can't be dealt with by fighting or fleeing, if it's psychological, then all that glucose is just floating around with nothing to do. And it needs to go somewhere, so it ends up getting stored in your belly as visceral fat. So if dieters are under chronic stress, the biological and behavioral changes that result from that stress response could undermine the effectiveness of the diet. All right, we're going to take this one step further. What if dieting itself is a chronic stressor? This is an important question for two reasons. First, who needs more stress in their life? If dieting causes stress, that's just one more reason not to diet. And second, and perhaps more importantly, if dieting causes stress, this could be one more reason why diets fail, because diets themselves cause these physical and psychological changes that make it difficult to lose weight. A group of researchers have actually looked at this question. First, they determined that there are two main tasks to dieting. The first task is restricting your calorie intake, so not eating what you want, which leads you to feel hungry all the time. That's what most people think about when they think about dieting, and it seemed plausible that restricting might lead to stress. The second task of dieting is to monitor your food intake. So keeping track of what you eat, counting your calories, planning out your meals, etc. It also could be that this is stressful to do. In this study, the researchers looked at the independent and combined effects of these tasks. Participants were assigned to one of four conditions: monitoring and restricting, monitoring only, restricting only, and control. Participants assigned to the monitoring and restricting condition received training designed by a registered dietitian on how to follow a classic low-calorie diet consisting of 1,200 calories per day, and also received instructions on how to complete a daily food diary to monitor their caloric intake. Participants in the monitoring-only condition were not placed on a low-calorie diet, but were instructed on how to complete a daily food diary, so they just monitored their intake. The restricting-only condition was a bit more tricky. How do you get people to eat less without thinking about it? So in this condition, the researchers gave participants all the food that they ate over the course of the study. The food was prepackaged and prepared food from two diet food companies, and the daily menus varied, but calorie intake was restricted to 1,200 calories a day, as in the full monitoring plus restricted diet. Participants in the control condition did neither of these things. The study lasted for 3 weeks. Additionally, the researchers measured cortisol for 2 days before and 2 days after the diets to see if the participants had a physiological stress response. And here's what they found. The only thing that mattered is whether the participants were restricting their diets. If participants were on a restricted diet, they had an increase in cortisol output, whereas if they were not on a restricted diet, they didn't. And that's what this graph is showing you. The x-axis shows you the baseline, so the days before the diet started, and the post-manipulation measure, which was 2 days after the diet ended. The y-axis shows you the total cortisol output. So before the study, the two groups, restricted and not restricted, had similar levels of cortisol. However, after the study, the restricted groups had higher levels of cortisol, suggesting more stress compared to the non-restricted group. So, in sum, dieting may cause a physiological stress response that might itself undermine the diet. Now, moving on to the middle question on the flowchart. Is dieting safe? The study I just told you about suggests that it might not be, because it causes a physiological stress response. There's also a fair bit of other evidence out there suggesting that diets may actually be harmful to your health. Weight cycling appears to have negative consequences for your overall health. Weight cycling, or weight yo-yoing, occurs as people go on a diet, lose weight, stop the diet, gain back the weight, go on another diet, lose the weight again, only to regain the weight, etc., etc. This constant diet has been shown to be linked with a variety of bad health outcomes. Weight cycling is linked to increased all-cause mortality, increased mortality from cardiovascular disease, increased risk of heart attack, stroke, and diabetes, increased cholesterol, increased blood pressure, and even impaired immune functioning. All of these findings, importantly, control for body mass index. There's also some newer evidence looking at telomeres. These researchers found that dietary restraint, which is a measure of chronic dieting, was associated in two separate samples with shorter telomere length, even after controlling for BMI, smoking, and age. This means that chronic dieting is associated with accelerated aging. However, a lot more research is necessary to say anything definitive about these results. Having only one study on these results suggests that there might be a connection, but it doesn't fully prove the connection. Related to this idea of whether dieting is healthy is the question of whether or not losing the weight actually leads to actual health benefits. You read an op-ed for class titled, "Is Dieting Worth the Trouble?" and the results from that huge intervention suggest that it's not. Dieters in the Look Ahead trial were able to maintain a 5% weight loss for 4 years, so by today's standards, these dieters were successful in the long term. The weight loss did lead to improved quality of life, decreases in sleep apnea, reduced need for diabetes medication, and delayed physical disability. However, it didn't lead to fewer strokes, heart attacks, or cardiovascular deaths, which was really the goal of the intervention. So, is dieting safe? Well, maybe not. Diets lead to stress, which increases cortisol levels, and yo-yo dieting leads to numerous different negative health consequences. When thinking about whether or not diets are safe, we have to consider the alternative. Is obesity unhealthy? We need to look at this question as well because diets may be unsafe, but if they're less unsafe than obesity, then perhaps diets aren't so bad after all. So, of course, everybody thinks that obesity is unhealthy, but we should at least consider the possibility that it isn't. There are two reasons that obesity might not be as unhealthy as most people think. First, the evidence that obesity is related to poor health is purely correlational. Nobody is randomly assigning people to be obese or not be obese and then assessing their long-term health outcomes. And because the evidence is correlational, the door is open for there to be some confounds, third variables, that cause both obesity and poor health. To be clear, obesity is correlated with a lot of things that do cause diseases. For example, one thing that we know causes a lot of health problems, particularly heart-related ones, is being sedentary. Nobody's saying that being sedentary is healthy, but you need to think one step further and realize that since obese people are much more likely to be sedentary than non-obese people, you're going to see a lot of these obese people who are unhealthy. But perhaps it's not their obesity that's unhealthy, but rather their sedentary lifestyle. Another thing we know that causes health problems and that's correlated with obesity is weight cycling, which we just discussed. Weight cycling is incredibly bad for your heart. Well, obese people are more likely to have yo-yoed than non-obese people. In the eating disorders literature, when they talk about the health risks of bulimia, they always point out that yo-yoing, which bulimics tend to do, is very bad for your health. But when they talk about obese people, they seem to forget about this and blame their health problems on their weight, not on their history of yo-yo dieting. Another thing that's highly related to health problems is low socioeconomic status. Obese people are more likely to be poor. Perhaps their health problems are more related to their SES than to their weight. Finally, obese people are more likely to avoid doctors or fail to make use of medical care, which is also related to poor health outcomes. Doctors tend to have strong anti-fat biases, so it's understandable that obese people feel uncomfortable and embarrassed when they visit their doctors. Furthermore, when they do visit the doctor, obese people are less likely to get preventative care, they get treated later in the course of their illnesses, and it may be because of these things that their health outcomes are worse than non-obese people. The second reason why obesity may not be so bad for our health is because the correlations between health outcomes and BMI aren't that strong or consistent. That is, the relationship between obesity and poor health is fairly weak. Only the most extreme levels of obesity are reliably related to poor health outcomes. Aside from causing diabetes and some osteoarthritis, the links between obesity and most diseases are weak to non-existent. Consider the best health outcome that we have, mortality. These graphs show you the relative risks of mortality by BMI category and age. The far left graph is for people between the ages of 25 and 59. The middle graph is for people between the ages of 60 and 69. And the far right graph is for people above the age of 70. The bottom of the graphs represent the different BMI categories. The different dots within each group represent different samples of participants. The square is the combined data, so it makes most sense to just focus on the squares in these graphs. As you can see on these graphs, obesity doesn't seem to lead to earlier death. If obesity caused a whole bunch of diseases, you'd expect people to die of them sometimes. But you don't see that. During the last 30 years, as the numbers of obese people have skyrocketed, death rates have stayed the same. Researchers have commented that life expectancy rates may soon level out or actually decline due to obesity. However, when they make this claim, they always mention some other types of diseases as the final culprit leading to death, such as lung cancer or heart attacks, which may be caused by other factors like leading a sedentary lifestyle. So, it seems like obesity isn't necessarily unhealthy. Now, that doesn't mean that individuals who are obese don't have other health issues. It just means that their main health concerns may stem from some other health behaviors, such as leading a sedentary lifestyle. Given the ineffectiveness of diets in the long term for most people, and evidence that dieting itself may cause health problems, plus the less than definitive causal link between obesity and poor health, some researchers suggest that A, dieting is not going to solve the obesity epidemic, and B, we shouldn't be recommending dieting as a treatment for obesity. Instead of trying to lead obese people to lose weight and failing at it, why don't we change the goal? It makes sense that we should pick a goal that's easier to achieve. How about trying to lead obese people, and actually all people, whether obese or not, to improve their health rather than to lose weight. Improved health really is a much easier goal. Nobody seems to notice because everybody's so obsessively focused on weight. But it seems clear that you can improve people's health without forcing them to try to lose tons of pounds. You can do this simply with exercise. Let me give you one example. In one recent study, 58 obese subjects exercised 5 times per week for 12 weeks at an intensity of 70% of their maximum heart rate. The length of the exercise session was set up so that they would burn 500 calories each session. And the thing that really sets this study apart from most other exercise studies is that the exercise sessions were done in the lab and supervised, so subjects absolutely had to do it. There was no cheating possible and no slacking off possible, and absolutely no question about whether the exercise occurred and at the right intensity. They found that overall participants lost 7 pounds of body weight, so not so bad for 12 weeks really. But the researchers considered this unsuccessful because not every subject lost weight, and a handful of their subjects gained 2 or 3 pounds. So they split their sample into 2 groups. The group that lost as much weight or more weight as the researcher expected, and a group that lost less weight than the researcher expected. And then the researcher compared these 2 groups of subjects on the health outcomes that they measured. So what did they find? Well, first, looking at the participants who did lose a reasonable amount of weight, the researchers found improvements in resting heart rate, blood pressure, and waist circumference. He also found improvements in their cardiorespiratory fitness. Okay, so now look at those subjects who were supposedly failures. Those subjects who didn't lose much weight, or any weight, or indeed maybe even gained weight. What happened to them? The same exact improvements on every measure. So this is actually extremely good news. Exercise leads to all these important health changes, even if it doesn't lead to an impressive amount of weight loss. The funny thing is, this is exciting and important good news was completely hidden in a paper called Exercise Alone is Not Enough. The researchers of this paper and all the reporters who covered it, this work was actually on the cover of Time magazine, were so blinded by their focus on weight change that they didn't see what was staring them right in the face. Exercise is the answer. If we can just acknowledge that it's not our business or our mission to make people look a certain way, but rather that it's our important job to improve the health of the people in our country, then we come to the inevitable conclusion that promoting exercise is the answer and promoting dieting is not.